On the 4th of July, 1973, the Guards' Chapel filled with 800 guests, and the Queen Mother, Princess Anne and Princess Margaret, came to watch a cavalry officer marry the woman he had kept waiting for the better part of 7 years. It looked like the society wedding of the season. It was. And yet the marriage sealed that morning would run for 21 years on a private understanding almost no one outside their world would forgive. A quiet agreement that each of them could love elsewhere so long as the appearance held. For 2 decades it did hold, protected by faith, by family, by the palace, and by a press that still looked away. The question underneath the vows was never whether the marriage was happy. It was who agreed to keep it and why. If you enjoy the true stories behind Britain's grandest names, the ones told with the doors finally open, subscribe now and stay with this one to the end, because the answer sits in the last chapter. Chapter 1. 2 people, 1 closed world. They were born 8 years apart into the same small English world where everyone's grandfather had known everyone else's. Andrew Henry Parker Bowles arrived on the 27th of December, 1939, in Surrey, the eldest of 4 children. And from the first, he belonged to a particular and vanishing kind of England. His father, Derek Parker Bowles, kept a house called Donnington Castle House in Berkshire, and moved with easy familiarity through the worlds of racing and the court. His mother, Anne, was a de Trafford, daughter of a famous racing baronet whose colours were known on every English course. On one side, the family reached back to the Earls of Macclesfield, on the other to a line of horsemen and landowners who had held their acres for generations. They were not dukes. They did not need to be. They were old Catholic gentry, secure in themselves, rooted in land and faith, and they carried an air that money alone could never buy. That Catholicism is not a detail to be passed over. It ran through the family like a seam of stone, and it would decide, quietly and completely, the shape of Andrew's life. He was sent to Ampleforth, the great Benedictine school set among the folds of the Yorkshire moors, where the discipline was as much spiritual as academic, and where a boy learned that some doors in England would always be closed to him because of the church his family knelt in. He learned it without complaint. It was simply the water he swam in. To be a Catholic of good family in the England of that time was to belong, and yet to be held slightly apart, welcome in every drawing room and barred all the same from certain summits that a Protestant of the same rank might climb. Andrew grew up inside that quiet contradiction, and it taught him early that a man could hold a thing and be denied it in the same breath. His christening had signalled how close to the centre of things the family stood. Several accounts hold that Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother herself, stood as one of his godmothers, and while that claim is widely reported rather than firmly documented, it points to a truth that is not in doubt. The Parker Bowleses were woven into the fabric of court and racing society, friends of the great, at ease in the company of royalty. Andrew was born not adjacent to the royal world, but inside its outermost room, and he would spend his life moving through its chambers, closer and closer to the throne, until the very intimacy that had seemed a blessing became the setting for his deepest humiliation. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on the 17th of July, 1947, at King's College Hospital in London, and raised at a house called The Lanes in the green quiet of East Sussex. Her father was Major Bruce Shand, a cavalry officer of real distinction, and his story matters here, because he was the template of the honourable soldier against which his daughter's husband would one day be silently measured. Bruce Shand had won the Military Cross in the retreat to Dunkirk in 1940, and a bar to that cross in the North African desert 2 years later, before he was wounded and captured near the coast of Egypt in the autumn of 1942. and held as a prisoner of war in Germany for the rest of the fighting. After the war, he became a Mayfair wine merchant and a master of foxhounds, a man of understated bravery and perfect manners, and in time the author of a well-regarded memoir of his soldiering. He raised his daughter to be exactly what she became: warm, funny, unafraid of men, entirely at ease in a saddle or a drawing room. Her mother was Rosalind Cubitt, and through her the family carried a piece of Edwardian history that will matter greatly before this story is done. Camilla's great-grandmother had been Alice Keppel, the celebrated mistress of King Edward VII. The blood of the last great royal affair ran in her veins, and she grew up knowing it, raised on the family law of a woman who had loved a king and managed it with such grace that society never turned against her. It was an inheritance most families would have buried. In the Shand household, it was simply part of who they were, and it planted in the young Camilla an understanding, absorbed long before she could have named it, that a woman of her line might love a great man outside the ordinary rules and survive it. The two families that would join in 1973 were mirror images of the same England, and it is worth setting their measures side by side. Through his father, Andrew descended from a line that reached back to the Earls of Macclesfield, and through his mother, he was the grandson of a racing baronet, a man whose horses ran under famous colours on every course in the land. His father kept a castle house in Berkshire and counted the Queen Mother among his friends. Camilla's father was a man twice decorated for gallantry, a master of hounds who hunted his own country, and her mother carried the blood of a king's mistress. Neither family was titled at the highest rank, and neither needed to be. They were the deep gentry and the minor aristocracy, the class that actually ran the shires while the dukes decorated the headlines. And among such people, a marriage was watched, weighed, and quietly steered by everyone who mattered. When two families of this kind decided that a match should happen, it was not easily resisted, as Andrew Parker Bowles would in time discover. Set these two families side by side, and the marriage that would one day join them looks almost inevitable. They belonged to the same few hundred people, the ones who shot the same coverts, hunted the same country, danced at the same balls, and married, generation after generation, among themselves. It was a world with its own weather and its own laws, and one of those laws concerned marriage itself. In this England, a marriage among the great families was not only a matter of love, it was an alliance, a settlement, a joining of land and name and blood, and it came with an old and unspoken understanding about what a husband and wife owed each other and what they did not. Passion was welcome. Discretion was required. And what happened behind a couple's own front door was considered, by long agreement, nobody else's affair. Andrew grew into this world as though born to lead it. He was tall, dark, and effortlessly charming, with the kind of looks that turned heads across a room and the kind of manner that made the turning seem accidental. He rode beautifully and dangerously. He talked to women as though each were the only one present, and he meant it, briefly, every time. By his 20s, he had a reputation, and the reputation was not for constancy. Camilla, coming up behind him, was cut from cloth just as sure of itself, though quieter. She was not a conventional beauty in the way the age prized, and she never pretended to be. What she had was better and rarer. She was good company. She laughed easily and made others laugh. She listened. She loved horses and dogs and the outdoors, and she carried herself with an unbothered confidence that men found magnetic and other women found impossible to dislike. The world that made them is the first character in this story, because it explains everything that follows. It explains why two people who could not stay faithful to each other would nonetheless stay married for 21 years. It explains why an affair conducted almost in the open could be tolerated by families, by the church, and by the servants who saw all of it. And it explains why, when the whole arrangement finally shattered, it shattered not from within, but from without. Broken open by forces this closed world had never had to reckon with before. These were people raised to keep the appearance up, and to believe that keeping it up was itself a kind of virtue. They would test that belief to its limit, and before it was over, the small world that raised them would be turned inside out on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. But that was decades away, and unimaginable, on the afternoons when a young Camilla Shand first began to notice the dashing officer everyone was talking about, and decided, with the quiet stubbornness that would define her whole life, that she wanted him. Chapter 2. The Most Eligible Man in the Blues. By the time he was 30, Andrew Parker Bowles wore the sovereign's own uniform and had a reputation that ran ahead of him into every drawing room. He had gone from Ampleforth to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, and in 1960 he was commissioned into the Royal Horse Guards, the regiment known simply as the Blues, one of the two mounted regiments of the household cavalry that guard the monarch in person. For a young man of his background, it was the perfect billet, glamorous and ancient and close to the throne, and he wore it as though it had been cut for him alone. The pull he exerted becomes clear the moment you picture the setting. The household cavalry is the most theatrical soldiering in the British Army, all breastplates and plumes and black horses, the living scenery of monarchy itself. An officer in the Blues did not merely serve, he performed at coronations and state visits and the great summer parades, in front of the whole nation and the sovereign at its centre. Andrew moved through this pageantry with total ease, and off the parade ground he was, if anything, more compelling still, because he added to the uniform a physical daring that even hardened horsemen respected. He was a bold amateur jockey, one of the genuine article, and in 1969 he rode a horse called the Fosser in the Grand National at Aintree, the most punishing steeplechase in the world, where grown men break bones and worse over fences the height of a man. To ride the National at all is to declare a certain contempt for your own safety. Andrew had it. That nerve was real, and it was of a piece with the soldier he became, because his courage was not only for the racecourse. It was tested in places a great deal more dangerous than Aintree, and it did not fail. Consider the shape of the career, for it is a record of steady ascent toward the very heart of the crown. He served as aide-de-camp to the Governor-General of New Zealand in the middle of the decade. He was adjutant of the Royal Horse Guards from 1967 and of the amalgamated Blues and Royals as the regiments joined at the end of the decade. He was promoted Major on the last day of 1971. In 1972, he led a squadron during Operation Motorman in Northern Ireland, the largest British military operation mounted since the Suez Crisis, sent to retake the barricaded no-go areas of Belfast and Londonderry. At the end of the decade, he went to Rhodesia as senior military liaison officer to Lord Soames, the last governor, through the tense and lethal transition to an independent Zimbabwe. And for that service, he was given the Queen's Commendation for Bravery in 1980 and promoted lieutenant colonel that same summer. There would be more to come: a mounted regiment to command, an appointment to the Order of the British Empire, and higher offices still that placed him at the sovereign's own side. This was not ceremony alone. This was hard, dangerous soldiering by a man who was very good at it. The full ledger of his service reads like a map of the whole military establishment, and it is worth laying the honours out, because they are the true measure of his standing. Commissioned into the Blues in 1960. adjutant of the regiment through the closing years of that decade, major on the last day of 1971, a squadron in Belfast in 1972, the liaison post in Rhodesia and the commendation for bravery in 1980, and his lieutenant colonelcy the same year, command of the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment in the early 80s, the Order of the British Empire in 1984, and then the office that would become the cruelest of all, Silver Stick in Waiting to the Queen, held from 1987, one of the sovereign's own ceremonial guardians, a post of real intimacy with the monarch. He was made a brigadier in 1990 and retired in 1994 after 34 years in uniform. 34 years of loyalty to the crown, climbing steadily toward the throne at the exact moment his private life was being tied, in ways he could not undo, to the throne's own heir. And yet the same man who would ride Aintree and face down a barricade in Belfast could not, it seemed, be faithful to a woman for longer than the mood lasted. This was the paradox at the centre of him, and it was known. His charm was continuous, and his attention was not. He pursued, he delighted, he moved on, and he left behind him a trail of young women who had each briefly believed themselves the exception. In the tight world he moved through, this was noted and forgiven, and noted again. He was too charming to cut, too well connected to snub, and in the code of that world, a young man's wildness was expected to burn itself out in marriage soon enough. It was assumed by everyone who knew him that the right wife would settle him. The assumption would prove entirely wrong, but it was universal, and Camilla shared it. The most consequential of his early attachments was the one that could never end in marriage at all. From around 1970, Andrew Parker Bowles was romantically linked with Princess Anne, the only daughter of the Queen, a keen and fearless rider who moved in exactly his world of horses and hunting. They were well matched in temperament and in nerve, and the attraction was real on both sides. But it ran straight into the oldest wall in English public life. Andrew was a Roman Catholic, and a Catholic could not marry an heir in the line of succession without that heir surrendering their place. The biographer Sally Bedell Smith put it plainly, observing that the relationship could not have been very serious precisely because Andrew was Catholic. The faith that had shaped his schooling now shaped his heart's prospects. A whole future was closed to him before it began, and it was closed by the act of settlement and 3 centuries of English fear of Rome. So the affair with the princess remained what it could only be, warm and doomed, and it settled in time into something rarer and more durable than romance. Andrew and Anne became lifelong friends, bound by horses and by an understanding that never needed speaking. He would one day be godfather to her daughter. Decades later, long after both their marriages had come and gone, he would still be at her side at Ascot. The romance faded. The loyalty never did. It was the first sign of a quality in Andrew Parker Bowles that would confuse the whole country later on, the ability to be let down, or to let others down, and to keep the friendship standing all the same. He was a man, it seemed, who could separate love from loyalty entirely, holding to the second long after the first had gone. And that unusual capacity would one day carry him through a humiliation that would have broken almost anyone else. But in the early 1970s, none of that was settled. He was the most eligible bachelor in the smartest regiment in the army, a decorated soldier and a race rider with a prince's daughter on his arm and a reputation for breaking hearts. And he was in no hurry at all to give any of it up. He had everything a young man of his world could want, and no reason he could see to choose only one path when he might keep them all open a little longer. Somewhere just behind him, patient and increasingly certain, a young woman from Sussex was waiting for him to notice that she was the one he should have chosen all along. Chapter 3. The Girl Who Loved Him First. Camilla Shand had wanted Andrew Parker Bowles for years before a prince ever crossed her path. That fact is the quiet hinge of the whole story, and it is worth holding on to, because the world would later tell the tale backwards, as though Camilla were a woman who married one man while secretly pining for another she had loved first. The truth ran the other way. Long before Charles, there was Andrew, and the wanting was hers, and it was real, and it was not easily satisfied. They had met in the late 1960s, introduced, in one well-sourced account, through Andrew's younger brother Simon, who worked at her father's wine firm. The connection was natural. They belonged to the same set, rode in the same country, knew the same people. What began as acquaintance became, on her side, something a good deal warmer, and for several years the two of them carried on a romance that could not have been more characteristic of the man at its centre. It ran on and off. It flared and cooled. It was broken again and again by Andrew's wandering eye, by the other women, and by the seasons when he turned his attention to Princess Anne. Camilla would have him back, and then he would drift, and then he would return, and she would have him back again. It says a great deal about her that she endured it. Camilla Shand was nobody's fool and nobody's doormat. She was clever, self-possessed, and entirely capable of walking away. That she did not, that she waited through years of a courtship any sensible friend would have told her to abandon, tells us how deep the attachment went. She had decided on him, in the unhurried, stubborn way that would mark every important choice of her life. She had looked at the least dependable man in her circle and concluded that he was hers, and she was prepared to wait out every distraction until he arrived at the same conclusion. It was the same patience she would later show in a far harder trial, when a whole country turned against her, and she simply waited, year after year, for it to change its mind. While she waited, her own life ran on. She had come out as a debutante, done the season, moved through the round of parties and weekends that structured a young woman's life in that world. She was popular and sought after, quick with a joke, comfortable in her own skin in a way that drew people to her. And it was in that round, at the very start of the new decade, that she met the other man who would define her century. The story, often told, is that Camilla and Charles, the young Prince of Wales, met around 1970 at the polo, or through the mutual friend Lucia Santa Cruz, or both. What is certain is that the two of them took to each other at once. She was easy and funny and unimpressed by his rank, which was precisely what he had never encountered before and could not resist. He was earnest and lonely inside the gilded isolation of his position, and here was a young woman who teased him and laughed with him and made him feel, for once, like a man rather than an institution. There is a famous line attached to their first meeting, and it belongs firmly in the realm of legend rather than record, so it should be told as legend. It is said that Camilla, with the cheerful boldness that was her signature, remarked to the prince that her great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, had been the mistress of his great-great-grandfather, King Edward VII, and asked in effect, how about it? Whether she ever said any such thing, no one can prove. But the fact underneath the story was entirely true. The blood of the last great royal mistress did run in Camilla's veins, and the parallel was not lost on anyone who knew the history. A pattern that had played out in the Edwardian age was preparing to play out again, in a world that would prove far less willing to look away, and the young woman at the centre of it carried the precedent in her own family tree. For a time, at the turn of the decade, Camilla stood between two men. There was Andrew, the one she truly wanted, maddening and unreliable, and always just out of reach. And there was Charles, the prince who was falling for her, offering a different and dizzying kind of future. It was a genuine tangle, and it grew more tangled still because of the symmetry running alongside it. At almost the same season that Camilla was involved with Charles, Andrew was involved with Charles's sister, Princess Anne. Two commoners, a prince and a princess, all entangled across the same few months in the same small world at the same country weekends. It reads like the plot of a novel, and it happened, and the four people at its heart would remain bound to one another in shifting combinations for the next 50 years. What drew Charles to Camilla is worth understanding, because it explains why the attachment proved so durable across so many years and so many obstacles. He was a young man raised in almost total isolation from ordinary human warmth, surrounded by deference, watched constantly, uncertain of who liked him for himself and who for his crown. Camilla treated him as none of these things. She was funny at his expense and hers. She shared his loves, the horses and the country and the hunt. She had no awe of him and no designs on his rank, because she had already given her heart to a cavalry officer and wanted nothing from the prince but his company. That absence of calculation was the rarest thing in the prince's whole world, and it bound him to her in a way that a more ambitious woman never could have managed. He had found the one person who saw the man and not the position, and he would spend the rest of his life, through his own marriage and hers, unable to let her go. It was the beginning of the attachment that would outlast every other relationship either of them formed, and that would, in the end, reshape the monarchy itself. But the tangle could only resolve one way. Charles, for all his feeling, was young, bound by duty, and not yet free to choose a wife, least of all, a young woman with a past and no royal blood. The rules that governed a Prince of Wales did not bend for a country girl he happened to adore, however much he might have wished them to. And Camilla, whatever the prince stirred in her, had already given her heart elsewhere. When Charles left, at the start of 1973, on a long deployment with the Royal Navy, the relationship between them lapsed, as such things did when a sailor prince went to sea. The field was clear, and into that clearing stepped, at last, the man Camilla had been waiting for all along, though even now he would have to be pushed, because Andrew still would not commit. Years into the courtship, with Camilla plainly devoted and the whole set expecting it, he hung back, unwilling to close the door on his freedom. He was, by every account, fond of her, more than fond. But fondness had never yet been enough to make Andrew Parker Bowles do the one thing he most resisted, which was to choose. The woman who loved him first was about to learn that in their world, when a man could not bring himself to propose, there were others who would arrange matters for him. Chapter 4. An engagement in the newspaper. When Andrew would not propose, two fathers made the decision for him and put it in the Times. It is one of the most telling details in the whole marriage, and it sets the tone for everything that follows, because the union that Britain would remember as a great romance did not begin with a bended knee or a private word. It began with a notice in a newspaper, placed by the parents, to force the hand of a man who could not be trusted to move on his own. The account comes from the biographer Sally Bedell Smith, and it is as revealing as it is faintly comic. By the spring of 1973, Camilla had been Andrew's girlfriend, on and off, for the better part of 7 years. The relationship had gone on long enough, and the two families had run out of patience. And so, in the old manner, Derek Parker Bowles and Bruce Shand took the matter into their own hands. They simply published an engagement notice in the Times for their children, announcing to the world a betrothal that the groom had not, in fact, yet offered. As Bedell Smith dryly put it, his hand publicly forced, Andrew proposed to his girlfriend, of nearly 7 years. The proposal came after the announcement. The private choice followed the public fact. It was, in the most literal sense, a marriage half arranged, and the arranging had been done by the parents in the pages of a newspaper. There is something almost perfect about this beginning, given all that came after. Here was a couple whose entire married life would be a matter of managing appearances, and the appearance came first from the very start, printed in the paper before the reality had caught up with it. Here was a man who could not commit, gently trapped by his own world into committing. And here was a woman who had waited years for exactly this, and who now had it, whatever the route by which it arrived. Camilla had won. The prize was the man she wanted. The cost, though she cannot have measured it fully that spring, was a lifetime of not quite being able to hold him. The very manner of the engagement carried a warning inside it. A man who has to be pushed to the altar by a notice in the Times is not a man transformed by love into constancy. He is the same man, now married. The wedding itself was staged as the event of the season, and its guest list told the whole world what these two families were and where they stood. It took place on the 4th of July, 1973, at the Guards' Chapel in Wellington Barracks, in a Roman Catholic service that honoured Andrew's faith. A reported 800 guests filled the chapel and the reception that followed, a vast gathering by any measure drawn from the army, the aristocracy, and the court. And the great figures of the royal world came in person. The Queen Mother was there. Princess Anne was there, watching the man she had once been linked with marry another woman, only months before her own wedding. Princess Margaret was there. The presence of these royal guests, at the marriage of two people who held no royal rank themselves, was not a courtesy. It was an endorsement, a public folding of Andrew and Camilla into the innermost circle of British life, witnessed and blessed by the family at the summit of the nation. The bride wore the Camilla Shand tiara, an heirloom that reached back through her mother's family to the Edwardian world of Alice Keppel, so that the last great royal mistress was present, in a sense, in the jewels on the bride's head. It is the kind of detail that a novelist would be told to cut for being too neat, and yet it was real. The woman marrying into the innermost royal circle wore, as she did so, the inherited ornament of the family's own royal mistress, the physical token of a precedent that would soon repeat itself. Everything about the day pointed both backward and forward at once, to the affair that had made the family famous and to the one that would make it infamous. The setting itself carried a meaning that would only become clear in hindsight. The Guards' Chapel stood at Wellington Barracks, the home of the soldiers who guard the sovereign, the very heart of the ceremonial monarchy that Andrew served. To marry there, in his own military world, before the Queen Mother and two princesses, was to be married at the innermost hearth of the crown, folded bodily into the royal family's own ground. And the guest who mattered most for what came later was Princess Anne. She sat in that chapel and watched Andrew marry Camilla, the man she had been linked with taking a wife, and within 4 months she would marry Captain Mark Phillips at Westminster Abbey. The two romances that had tangled a whole generation together were both resolved inside a single year, in 2 great ceremonies 4 months apart, and the friendships they left behind, Andrew's with Anne, Camilla's with Charles, would prove more permanent than either wedding. On that July morning, though, none of that was visible. There was only a bride in an heirloom tiara, a soldier in his best, 800 guests in the summer light, and a future that looked, to everyone present, entirely secure. To the 800 guests, and to the newspapers that recorded it, the day looked like a triumph. The dashing brigadier of the future and the popular, warm-hearted girl who had finally landed him, blessed by the church, applauded by royalty, launched into a golden life of horses and country houses and service to the crown. It was the society wedding of the season, and everything about it promised permanence. The vows were sincere. The affection was real. Nobody in that chapel was pretending, on that particular morning, to feel something they did not feel. Whatever the marriage would later become, it did not begin as a cynical act. It began as a genuine wedding between two people who cared for each other, in front of a world that wished them well. And yet the tangle that had preceded the wedding did not simply vanish because the register was signed. Charles was still at sea, and reports would later hold that the prince had been heartbroken to learn of the marriage, even that he had made some last attempt to prevent it. Though this belongs to the biographer's account rather than the documented record and must be held lightly. Andrew's nature had not changed with a ring, and the symmetry that had run through the whole courtship completed itself with almost eerie neatness a few months later. On the 14th of November 1973, barely 4 months after Andrew married Camilla, Princess Anne married Captain Mark Phillips at Westminster Abbey. Both of Andrew's great romances, the woman he wed and the princess he could not, resolved themselves in opposite directions in the same single year. It was as though the whole tangled generation reshuffled itself at once and dealt out new hands. So the marriage began at its peak on a summer morning, in a chapel full of the great and the good, with a tiara and a decorated soldier and the blessing of the throne. Everything after this was dissent, though not the kind the newspapers would eventually describe, and not at the pace anyone expected. The dissent would be slow, private, and for a very long time, entirely invisible to the outside world. It would be managed, tolerated, and kept quiet by everyone with a reason to keep it quiet, which was everyone. The golden couple walked out of the guards' chapel into the sunshine and into an arrangement that would define the rest of their lives. The appearance had been established. Now the two of them would spend 21 years learning exactly how much reality it could be made to hold. Chapter 5. Separate interests, separate rooms. The marriage was barely a few years old when the pattern that would define it set hard. The couple began their life together at Bolhide Manor, a gabled Elizabethan house near Allington in Wiltshire, deep in the horse country, where both of them were most at home. It was the right setting for the life they meant to lead, a life of hunting and stables and long country weekends, of dogs on the flagstones and mud on the boots, the settled rhythm of the English shires. On the surface, it was idyllic. Beneath the surface, almost from the beginning, the marriage was becoming something other than the union the wedding had promised. In 1974, their first child was born, a son, Tom, and the prince himself stood as one of his godfathers, a courtesy that already hints at how entangled these lives had become. 4 years later, in 1978, came a daughter, Laura. On paper, it was a growing, happy family in a beautiful house, and in the ways that could be seen, it genuinely was. But the man at the center of it had not changed his nature on his wedding day, and the reputation that had followed him through his bachelor years followed him into his marriage without a pause. Andrew Parker Bowles was, by the consistent account of every biographer who has examined the marriage, a serial adulterer across its whole length. His affairs were numerous, and they were, by these accounts, more or less continuous. Some of them, it was reported, were with women in Camilla's own circle, which lent the whole business a particular sting. This was not a case of a husband straying once in a weak moment and returning ashamed. It was a settled way of living. The charm that had made him irresistible as a young officer did not switch off because a ring was on his finger. He remained, in the phrase of the day, a ladies' man, and he remained one openly enough that the people around the marriage knew. and the knowledge simply became part of the texture of their lives, absorbed and unremarked. What is striking, and what makes this marriage so different from the ordinary story of a wandering husband, is Camilla's response, or rather the absence of the response one might expect. There was no great rupture. There were no scenes that anyone recorded, no ultimatums, no threats to leave. The marriage simply absorbed the infidelity and carried on. The reason requires setting aside the assumptions of a later and more romantic age and remembering the world these two came from, the world of the first chapter, with its old and unspoken rules about what a marriage among the great families actually was. In that world, a certain kind of infidelity was not a catastrophe. It was, if handled with discretion, an accommodation. Husbands strayed. Sometimes wives did too. What mattered was not perfect fidelity, which almost no one in that circle seriously expected, but the keeping up of the household, the raising of the children, the preservation of the name and the appearance. A marriage was a structure, and a structure could stand a great deal of private weather so long as its walls looked sound from the road. Camilla had been raised inside this understanding as surely as Andrew had. Her own great-grandmother's history had taught it to her before she could read. She knew the rules, and she applied them, not out of weakness, but out of a clear-eyed acceptance of the kind of man she had married and the kind of marriage her world made possible. There is a phrase that captures how such marriages arrange themselves, and it is the phrase of separate rooms. Physically and emotionally, the Parker Bowleses began, within a few years, to lead lives that ran alongside each other rather than together. They shared a house, children, a social world, and a genuine and lasting affection. What they increasingly did not share was fidelity, and after a time, by the accepted account, they stopped pretending to each other that they did. Each came to an understanding of the other's nature. Each, in time, would look elsewhere. And each, crucially, agreed without ever needing a formal agreement to let the other be. It was a settlement made in silence, ratified by nothing but habit, and it would prove more durable than many marriages founded on the strictest vows. The children anchored the whole thing, and they should not vanish from the story simply because the scandal is louder. Tom, the elder, would grow up to be a well-known food writer, educated at Eton, with the prince himself as one of his godfathers, a detail that shows how completely the two families had already braided together by the time the boy was born. Laura followed 4 years later. For all the private complexity of their parents' marriage, the two children were raised in a home that worked, in the ordinary rhythms of a country childhood, ponies and dogs, and the long green afternoons of the Wiltshire hunt country. Whatever the adults had agreed between themselves, they had agreed it around a family they both meant to keep, and the keeping of that family was, in the end, one of the strongest reasons the marriage endured as long as it did. It is easy, from the outside, to see only the affairs. From the inside, there was a house full of children who needed a home, and two parents who, whatever else they failed at, gave them one. This is the beginning of what can only be called an arrangement, and it is the true subject of this whole film. It is important to describe it carefully and without either sneering or excusing, because it was neither as cold nor as simple as it might sound. The Parker Bowleses were not two strangers sharing an address. By every account, they liked each other, laughed together, raised their children together, and remained, through all of it, genuine friends. The arrangement was not the death of their marriage. In a strange way, it was the thing that allowed their marriage to survive, because it removed from the union the one demand that neither of them was able to meet, the demand of exclusive fidelity, and replaced it with something they could both manage, a partnership of affection and tolerance with the passion permitted to run where it would. It worked because both of them wanted it to work, and both had reasons. For Andrew, the arrangement preserved everything he valued while costing him nothing he was unwilling to pay. He kept his marriage, his family, his standing, his position close to the throne, and his freedom all at once. For Camilla, it preserved a settled home and family, and it left the door open, though neither of them can have fully seen this yet, to the one attachment from her past that had never entirely died. In the first years of the marriage, that door stayed mostly closed. The old feeling for Charles was there, banked down, but the prince was elsewhere, and the marriage was new, and the children were small. The arrangement, in its early form, was mostly about Andrew's affairs and Camilla's quiet acceptance of them. But arrangements have a way of running in both directions once they are established, and this one would. The tolerance Camilla extended to her husband was a tolerance she would, in time, need extended to herself. The rules that let Andrew stray were the same rules that would let Camilla, when the moment came, turn back toward the man she had known before her marriage, with her husband's knowledge and, by the reported account, without his objection. The machinery was now in place, quietly, in a beautiful house in Wiltshire, among the horses and the children and the ordinary business of a country life. All it needed was for the prince to come back into range. And in the summer of 1980, a house changed hands a short drive from the Parker Bowles' front door, and the whole geometry of the marriage shifted. Chapter 6. The Prince Moves to the Country. In the summer of 1980, a house changed hands a short drive from the Parker Bowles' front door. The Duchy of Cornwall, the great estate that funds the Prince of Wales, bought Highgrove House, near Tetbury in Gloucestershire, for a sum believed to be somewhere between £800,000 and £1 million. On the face of it, it was simply a prince acquiring a country home, one of the least remarkable things a prince can do. In the context of this marriage, it was the single most consequential purchase of the whole story because of where Highgrove stood. It stood in the heart of the Duke of Beaufort's hunt country, the same country the Parker Bowleses rode, only a short drive from their own homes. This was not coincidence in the sense of accident, though whether it was fully deliberate, no one can finally say. What is certain is the effect. The prince had installed himself inside Camilla's own county, in her own hunting world, among her own friends and neighbours, close enough that the two of them now moved through the same landscape as a matter of ordinary life. A relationship that would otherwise have required contrivance, secret journeys, careful excuses, was suddenly woven into the plain geography of the shires. And by the time Highgrove was bought, the old attachment between Charles and Camilla had already revived. The biographers place the rekindling around the end of the 1970s, roughly 1978 or 1979. The circumstances were exactly those the arrangement had made possible. Camilla's marriage had settled into its tolerant, separate rhythm. Andrew was occupied, often literally elsewhere, with his career and his own affairs. And Charles, now in his early 30s, unmarried, and increasingly aware that he would soon be pressed to find a wife, had come to see in Camilla the one woman who had ever made him feel understood. The young romance that the Navy had interrupted 7 years before picked up again, and this time it settled into something far more durable, because this time both of them were, in their different ways, free enough to sustain it. The arrangement absorbed this too. By the reported and consistent account of the biographers, Andrew Parker Bowles knew of his wife's renewed relationship with the prince, and he tolerated it. In some tellings, he did more than tolerate it. He is reported to have effectively approved of it, or at the least to have raised no objection, and the reason is not hard to find. A man who had spent his entire marriage in the beds of other women was in no moral position to forbid his wife a love of her own. The tolerance he had drawn on for years was now extended back to him, and he accepted the exchange. It must be said clearly that the precise degree of Andrew's knowledge and consent at any given moment is a matter of interpretation rather than record, and the honest biographers flag it as such. But the broad shape is not seriously disputed. This was a marriage in which both partners loved elsewhere, and both, for their own reasons, let it stand. The geography made it easy, and the easiness is the thing worth dwelling on because it explains how an affair could become not a crisis, but a fixture. When Charles was at Highgrove, Camilla was minutes away. They shared the hunt, the same circle of trusted friends, the same round of country weekends. Camilla, who had a fine eye for such things, even recommended to the prince the garden designer Lanning Roper, so that her taste was quite literally planted in the grounds of his house. The affair was not conducted in stolen hours in distant hotels. It was folded into the fabric of ordinary country life, protected by the discretion of a whole community that had every reason to say nothing and every custom telling it to. In that world, a great many people saw a great deal, and a great many people held their tongues, because holding one's tongue was simply what one did. The price of the house that made it all so convenient is worth stating plainly, because it fixes the scale of what the duchy was willing to spend to plant the prince in Camilla's own country. Highgrove was bought in the summer of 1980 for a figure believed to lie somewhere between £800,000 and a full million, a very great sum for a country house at that time. It sat in the Duke of Beaufort's hunt country, minutes from the Parker Bowles homes, in the same landscape of coverts and lanes and stables that Camilla had ridden all her life. Within a year of the purchase, Camilla had recommended to the prince the garden designer who would begin to shape its grounds, so that her hand was in the very earth of the place. A house of that price, in that exact spot, chosen at that exact moment, was not a neutral acquisition. Whether by design or by the deep pull of the heart, the prince had bought his way into the one corner of England where the woman he loved already lived, and the geography of the affair was settled for the next 15 years. For a time, the couple lived at Bolehide, and later they moved to Middlewick House near Corsham, a handsome Georgian house with paddocks and stabling that suited their horses and their hunting. Middlewick would become, in the tabloid retelling that came much later, notorious as the marital home to which the prince was a frequent weekend guest while Andrew was away. The salacious detail of that retelling is tabloid colour and should be treated with caution, for much of it was invented or embroidered after the fact. But the broad pattern, the prince welcomed into the orbit of the Parker Bowles household, the husband absent or untroubled, the whole thing conducted with the tacit knowledge of those around it, is not in serious doubt. What this arrangement actually asked of the people inside it was not nothing, and it is worth saying plainly. It asked Camilla to love a man she could not have openly, and to accept that her most important relationship would be lived in the shadows, unacknowledged, always second in the eyes of the world to whatever official life the prince would eventually be required to build. It asked Andrew to accept that his wife's deepest attachment was to another man, and a more powerful one, and to carry the private knowledge of it while keeping up, in public, the image of a settled marriage. And it asked both of them to maintain, year after year, a performance for the outside world, so long as the appearance held that bore less and less relation to the truth inside their own house. These were not small things to ask of anyone, and the fact that both of them managed it for years is a measure of how completely they had absorbed the code that made it possible. They managed it, remarkably, for years. The affair ran on, banked and steady, through the turn of the decade, and then, into this carefully balanced and long-tolerated arrangement, came the one force it had never been designed to withstand. Not exposure, not yet. Something more immediate and more human. In the summer of 1981, The Prince of Wales, under mounting pressure to marry and produce an heir, chose a bride. She was very young, beautiful, trusting, and entirely unprepared for the world she was marrying into. Her name was Lady Diana Spencer, and her arrival would begin, slowly at first and then all at once, to tear the whole quiet arrangement apart. Chapter 7. The Oldest Code in the County. What the Parker Bowleses were doing had a long history, and a set of rules older than either of them. A marriage like theirs could run for years on tolerated infidelity, without scandal, without rupture, without even much apparent distress, only because they were not inventing anything. They were the inheritors of a code, an old and unwritten aristocratic understanding about marriage and desire, and they were among its last and most conspicuous practitioners. This chapter steps back from the couple to look at the code itself, because the code is the load-bearing wall of the entire story, and without it, nothing they did makes sense. For centuries, in the upper reaches of British society, marriage among the great families had been understood as something quite distinct from the romantic ideal that would later come to dominate ordinary life. A marriage was, first and foremost, a dynastic and economic act. It joined estates. It secured bloodlines. It produced heirs to carry a name and hold a property together across the generations. Love was a welcome guest at such a marriage, but it was not the point of it, and its absence was not grounds for ending it. What the marriage required was continuity, and heirs, and the maintenance of the family's position. What it did not require, and what almost no one seriously expected, was lifelong passion between the two people at its centre. Into the space left by that missing passion came the discreet affair, and over time an elaborate etiquette grew up around it. The rules were never written down, but everyone who mattered knew them. An affair was permissible, provided it was conducted with discretion, provided it did not threaten the marriage as an institution, and provided, above all, that it was never allowed to become public in a way that forced the world to take official notice. Separate bedrooms were understood. The country house party, in an earlier age, had been arranged with a quiet attention to who might wish to visit whom along the corridor at night, the hostess allocating rooms with a discretion that everyone relied upon and no one discussed. A husband looked the other way, a wife looked the other way, and the marriage, the structure, the appearance, stood serene above it all. The genius of this code, if genius is the word, was that it allowed marriages to survive the thing that most often destroys them. By removing the expectation of fidelity, or at least by softening it into something negotiable, it removed the sense of betrayal that turns an affair into a catastrophe. A husband could stray without the marriage ending because the marriage had never been staked entirely on his faithfulness. A wife could do the same. The whole system ran on discretion and mutual tolerance, and it was, in its cold way, a functioning technology for keeping great families intact across the centuries, whatever the private truths of the people inside them. It was cruel in some ways and merciful in others, and it had governed the loves of the English aristocracy for longer than anyone could remember. The press even had a phrase for the kind of husband the code produced, and it attached itself to Andrew with particular cruelty. He came to be called, in a widely repeated epithet whose precise origin is impossible to pin down, the man who laid down his wife for his country, a bitter play on the language of soldierly sacrifice aimed at a soldier who had genuinely given years of service to the crown. The joke was ugly, and it was unfair, and it captured something true all the same. For the code did ask exactly that of a man in Andrew's position. It asked him to accept, for the sake of the family, the faith, and the appearance, a private humiliation that a man of an earlier and more romantic creed would have refused at any cost. Andrew accepted it. Whether he accepted it out of honor or convenience or simple weariness, the epithet does not say. But the fact that the country reached for such a phrase at all shows how completely the old code had ceased to be understood by the time the Parker Bowles marriage was exposed. What had once been an honorable discretion now read to a changed nation as a joke at a cuckold's expense. Camilla's own family carried the most famous example of the code in living memory, and it is impossible to tell this story without returning to it in full. Her great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, had been the acknowledged mistress of King Edward VII in the first years of the 20th century, and the arrangement had been managed with a smoothness that now seems almost unimaginable. Alice Keppel's husband tolerated the royal affair. Society accommodated it, with a discretion that now seems almost unimaginable. The whole Edwardian establishment closed around the affair and kept it in its place, neither hidden entirely nor ever officially acknowledged, held in the discreet middle ground where the code did its work. It was the arrangement at its most successful, and it was Camilla's inheritance in the most literal sense. The parallel between the two women, the Edwardian mistress and her great-granddaughter, is one of the most extraordinary rhymes in modern British history, and the people involved were entirely aware of it. Camilla grew up knowing what her great-grandmother had been. The famous, unverifiable line she is said to have spoken to Charles at their first meeting turned on exactly this knowledge. What Alice Keppel had done with Edward VII, Camilla would, in her own way and her own age, do with the man who would become King Charles III. The blood of the last great royal mistress had produced the next one, and the code that had protected Alice Keppel was the code the Parker Bowles marriage was running on 3 generations later, so long as the appearance could be held. The family had, in a sense, done this before, and had survived it beautifully, and that memory can only have made the arrangement feel safer than it truly was. The code was not only a rule about affairs, it was a whole philosophy of marriage, and it rested on a distinction that the modern world has largely forgotten, the distinction between a marriage as a private feeling and a marriage as a public institution. To the class that Andrew and Camilla came from, the institution was the thing that mattered. It carried the name, held the land, raised the heirs, and stood before the world as a fixed point in a shifting age. The feelings of the two people inside it were real and were hoped for, but they were secondary to the institution's survival, and if the feelings failed or wandered, the institution was expected to stand regardless. A marriage was a house you lived in, not a mood you indulged, and you did not pull the house down because the weather inside it had changed. Seen through that older lens, the tolerance the Parker Bowleses extended to each other was not a betrayal of marriage, but a defense of it, a way of keeping the house standing through storms that would have leveled a flimsier structure. It was the modern age, with its insistence that a marriage was nothing if it was not also a passion, that would find their arrangement unforgivable. But here is the crucial difference, and it is the difference that would eventually destroy everything. Alice Keppel had conducted her affair in a world that still worked the way the code required. The press deferred. Society kept its counsel. There was no technology that could reach inside a private room and carry its secrets to the street. The machinery of discretion was intact, and it held. Camilla was attempting the same arrangement in a world that was, year by year, ceasing to function that way at all. The deference was dying. The press was changing, growing hungrier, less reverent, and armed with new tools that could pierce any wall. The technology of privacy on which the whole code depended was breaking down, and the people relying on it did not yet fully understand that the ground was shifting beneath them. They were playing by rules that had governed their kind for centuries, in the last decade before those rules would be swept away entirely. The Parker Bowleses, and the prince alongside them, were the last generation to believe that a great family's private arrangements could be kept private by common consent. They were about to be proven, in the most public way imaginable, catastrophically wrong. Chapter 8. The Children and the Faith that Held It. There were two reasons the marriage did not simply end, and both of them mattered more than any lover. It would be easy, looking back through everything that came later, to wonder why Andrew and Camilla did not part far sooner, once the arrangement had settled, and each was so plainly attached elsewhere. The answer lies in two forces that bound them together far more powerfully than passion ever could, and both were rooted in the world that had made them. The first was their children. The second was their faith. The family life at the heart of the Parker Bowles marriage was not a fiction maintained for the neighbours. It was real, and it was, by the accepted accounts, warm. Tom, born in 1974, and Laura, born in 1978, grew up in a busy, affectionate, thoroughly ordinary upper-class country household, full of ponies and dogs and the whole apparatus of a rural childhood among the horsey gentry. Both parents were engaged and loving. Camilla, in particular, was, by every account, a devoted and hands-on mother. The warmth that would one day win over a hostile nation first spent on her own children in a Wiltshire farmhouse. Whatever ran on beneath the surface of the marriage, the children were raised in a home that functioned, and functioned happily, and that fact is not a minor detail. It was one of the marriage's central purposes, and one of the strongest reasons to preserve it. This is the thread that is easiest to lose in a story so dominated by scandal, and it is the thread that makes the arrangement comprehensible, rather than merely cynical. The Parker Bowleses had built something together that was worth keeping, a family, a home, a shared life among people and places they both loved. The arrangement was not designed to escape that life. It was designed to protect it, to allow the marriage that held the family together to survive the fact that neither partner could give the other exclusive love. Seen this way, the tolerance was not coldness. It was, in its own strange fashion, a form of loyalty, a decision by two people to keep intact the thing they had made, whatever else they permitted themselves. A child in that house did not grow up amid open warfare. A child in that house grew up loved, in a stable home, by two parents who had quietly agreed to keep the home standing. The weight of the faith is hard for a later and more secular age to feel, but it was real, and it pressed on Andrew from both directions at once. He had been raised at Ampleforth, among Benedictine monks, in a household where the church was not a Sunday habit, but the frame of the whole week. For such a man, divorce was not a legal inconvenience to be arranged and forgotten. It was a wound in the moral order, discouraged by the church he had knelt in all his life, something close to a personal failure before God. The same faith had already cost him a princess, for it was his Catholicism that had barred any marriage to Princess Anne, and now it stood between him and the exit from the marriage that Barr had helped to bring about. There is a grim symmetry in it. The church had steered him toward Camilla by closing the royal door, and then, having placed him in the marriage, forbade him to leave it. A lesser man might have raged at the trap. Andrew, so far as anyone can tell, simply accepted it, as he accepted so much, in silence, and set about making a livable peace with a marriage he could neither perfect nor end. The second force was older and heavier still, and it was Andrew's faith, which was by now the family's faith. The Parker Bowleses were Roman Catholics, and for a devout Catholic family, divorce was not the straightforward administrative unhappiness it might be for others. It was a grave matter, discouraged by the church, freighted with religious weight, something close to unthinkable for people raised as Andrew had been raised, at Ampleforth and in the observant household of his childhood. The same faith that had barred him from marrying Princess Anne now bound him to the marriage he had made. It cut both ways across his life. It had closed one door, the royal marriage he might once have wanted, and now it locked another shut behind him, the exit from the marriage he had. There is a deep irony here that the story cannot pass over, and it reaches all the way back to the beginning. The bar that had kept Andrew from Princess Anne was the same body of law and custom, the Act of Settlement, and the long English anxiety about Catholics near the crown that had shaped his whole life's possibilities. That anxiety had denied him a princess. It had steered him instead toward Camilla, the woman who would leave him, in her heart, for the future king. And now, the faith at the root of it all held him fast in the marriage that steering had produced. A man's religion had chosen his wife for him almost as surely as the notice in the Times had, closing the alternatives one by one until only this marriage remained, and then forbidding him to leave it. Andrew never spoke of any of this, but it sat beneath every choice he made, the quiet architecture of a life shaped, at every turn, by the church he had been born into. For a couple held together by children and by faith, the arrangement was not merely convenient, it was very nearly necessary. If the marriage could not honestly be ended, for the sake of the children and for the sake of the church, then it had to be made livable, and the only way to make it livable, given who they both were, was the old accommodation of tolerated, discreet infidelity. The code of their class and the doctrine of their church pointed to the same conclusion. Keep the marriage, keep the appearance, manage the rest in private. It was a solution that generations of Catholic gentry and Protestant aristocracy alike had reached before them, and the Parker Bowleses reached it too. Not as a scandal, but as a settlement, the most reasonable arrangement available to two people in their exact position. And so, through the early 1980s, the arrangement held, in equilibrium, sustained by everything around it. The children were young and thriving. The faith was firm. The class code was intact. Andrew's career was climbing toward its ceremonial summit, close to the throne. Camilla's attachment to the prince ran on, banked and discreet, at Highgrove and in the Hunt country. Two marriages, in a sense, occupied the same house, the public one that the world saw and the private arrangement that the world did not. And for a time, they coexisted without open conflict. It was, on its own terms, a remarkably stable instability, a settled arrangement that might, in an earlier age, have run on quietly to the end of both their lives, the way Alice Keppel's had. But the equilibrium depended on one thing above all, the thing named at the end of the last chapter. It depended on the world outside continuing to look away, on the appearance being permitted to stand in for the reality, on the ancient machinery of discretion continuing to function. And that machinery was about to be tested by a new arrival who had never agreed to any of the old rules, who did not come from the closed world and did not accept its code, and who would, without ever intending to, become the force that pulled the whole structure down. On the 29th of July, 1981, the Prince of Wales married Lady Diana Spencer, and the arrangement that had run so quietly for so long acquired, at last, the one thing it could not survive, a witness inside it who would not keep the code. Chapter 9. A third marriage under strain. The arrangement had survived everything the Parker Bowleses threw at it, but it had never had to survive Diana. Lady Diana Spencer was very young when she married the Prince of Wales, a generation younger than the world she was entering, and she came into it carrying none of the assumptions that had made that world work. She had not been raised to the code. She did not accept that a husband's heart could belong elsewhere while his marriage stood. She had married for love, or for what she believed was love, and she expected that love to be returned and to be exclusive. In the closed world of tolerated arrangements, she was a foreign body, and the arrangement began, from the very start, to reject her. And she it. The signs were there before the wedding even happened, and the most famous of them has become a small legend of its own. In the weeks before the marriage, Diana is said to have discovered a bracelet that Charles had commissioned as a gift for Camilla. It was engraved, by the accepted account, with the private nicknames the prince and Camilla used for each other, the silly, affectionate names of long intimacy, Fred and Gladys. To the young bride, it was devastating, a proof, held in her own hands 2 weeks before her wedding, that the man she was about to marry was bound to another woman. She went ahead with the wedding anyway. There was, by that point, no realistic way to stop it, and the machinery of a royal wedding, once set in motion, was not a thing a frightened young bride could halt. But she went into her marriage already knowing, or fearing, that she was the third person in it. For a few years the surface held. The children the marriage was meant to produce duly arrived, the heirs that secured the succession, and the nation had its images of a growing royal family. The world saw a fairy tale, the shy young princess and her prince, the most photographed couple on earth, adored from Sydney to San Francisco. But inside the marriage, the strain was constant and growing, and by the middle of the decade, around 1986, by the biographer's reckoning, the old attachment between Charles and Camilla, which had never truly ended, resumed in earnest. The prince turned back to the woman who had always understood him, and Diana, isolated inside a marriage that had never been hers alone, knew it, and the knowing curdled into a misery that she would not, in the end, keep to herself. What makes this stretch of the story so combustible is the collision of two completely different codes inside the same drama. On one side stood the old arrangement, the Parker Bowles marriage, and the world it came from, running on discretion, tolerance, and the careful keeping up of appearances. On the other side stood Diana, who belonged to a newer age and a different understanding of marriage entirely, one in which betrayal was betrayal, in which a wronged wife did not suffer in silence, and in which the private truth of a marriage might legitimately be brought into the open. The two codes could not coexist. One of them was going to break the other, and the arrangement, for all its centuries of precedent, was the more fragile of the two, because it depended entirely on silence, and Diana had no intention of staying silent forever. The confrontation that most vividly captures the collision came in 1989. At a party, Diana came face to face with Camilla, and instead of playing by the code, instead of the polite fiction that everyone in that world maintained, she said the unsayable. By her own later account, she told Camilla directly that she knew exactly what was going on between her and Charles. It was a small moment, two women exchanging words at a social gathering, but it marked something seismic. The appearance had been challenged from the inside, spoken against to its face. The younger woman had refused the silence on which the whole arrangement rested. It was a warning, though few understood it as one at the time, of exactly how this would end. The code survived on the agreement of everyone inside it to keep it. Diana had never agreed, and now she had said so aloud, to the other woman's face. The tragedy of the collision was that neither woman was simply in the wrong. Diana had married in good faith. A very young woman promised a fairy tale, and had discovered that she was the third person in her own marriage, bound to a husband whose heart lay elsewhere. Her refusal to accept it was not malice, but the honest reaction of a generation that had never agreed to the old bargain. Camilla, for her part, had loved Charles since before either marriage, and had lost him once to duty and the navy, and had come back to him inside a marriage of her own that already ran on the tolerance the code allowed. Each woman was, by the lights of her own world, behaving as that world had taught her. But the two worlds could not share a single husband, and the younger one, armed with a candor the older one found unthinkable, was always going to win, because candor, in the new age, was the stronger weapon. The old code had no defense against a woman willing to say out loud what everyone had agreed to leave unspoken. Somewhere behind this collision, largely unseen, stood Andrew, whose own marriage was now hostage to a battle being fought inside another marriage entirely. He had made his private peace with his wife's attachment years before, on the quiet terms the code allowed. He had not bargained for that attachment to become the pivot of a national drama, dragged into the open by a princess who owed his arrangement nothing. Everything he had accepted in private, he was now going to have to endure in public, and he had no say in the timing, the terms, or the manner of it. The most private decision of his life was about to be taken out of his hands entirely. There is a bleak irony in Andrew's situation across these years that the film should not pass over. He had spent the whole of his marriage as the more openly unfaithful of the two partners, the serial adulterer whose reputation had run ahead of him since his bachelor days. By the ordinary moral arithmetic, he was the last man entitled to the role of injured husband. And yet, because his wife's lover happened to be the heir to the throne, it was Andrew who would be cast, by a nation that knew nothing of his own conduct, as the wronged and pitiable figure at the centre of the drama. The arrangement had been mutual, entered by two people with open eyes. The public saw only one half of it, and assigned him a part he had not earned and did not want. He never corrected the impression, because correcting it would have meant discussing the arrangement, and discussing the arrangement was the one thing his whole code forbade. So he accepted a sympathy he had no right to, in exchange for keeping the silence that protected them both, and said nothing to set the record straight. Through all of this, Andrew Parker Bowles occupied a position of extraordinary and painful complexity, though he bore it, as ever, without public complaint. His wife's relationship with the prince was now entangled with the slow, agonizing collapse of the prince's own marriage, and the whole tangle was drawing closer to the surface with every passing year. And the timing of his own life made it crueler still. In these very years, Andrew reached the summit of his career. He commanded the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment in the early 80s. He was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire. And from 1987, he held one of the most intimate ceremonial offices in the land, Silver Stick in waiting to the Queen, a personal guardian of the sovereign at the great state occasions, an office of genuine closeness to the monarch and her family. He was, in public, the very picture of loyal service to the crown, standing at the Queen's own side, while in private, his marriage was becoming inseparable from the crisis engulfing the Queen's heir. He said nothing. He kept up his side of the appearance, as he always had. But the arrangement that had run so quietly for so long was now lashed to a far larger and far more violent story. And when that story finally broke into the open, the Parker Bowles marriage would be dragged into the light along with it, whether Andrew consented or not. Chapter 10. The War of the Waleses. By the early 1990s, the royal marriage had become a public battlefield, and the Parker Bowles arrangement was standing in the crossfire. What had been, through the 80s, a private unhappiness conducted behind palace walls now spilled out into open warfare, fought not with lawyers or courtiers, but with the most powerful weapon of the age, the press. The period even acquired a name that historians still use, the War of the Waleses, and it describes exactly what it was, a war waged by a husband and a wife through leaks and briefings and books and tapes, each seeking to win the public to their side. And in a war fought through the newspapers, the old code of discretion did not merely fail, it became the first casualty. The opening blow came in 1992, and it was a book. The journalist Andrew Morton published a work titled Diana, Her True Story, and though the princess's direct involvement was concealed at the time, it carried her account of her marriage in devastating detail. It told the world of her unhappiness, of her sense of being the third person in her own marriage, of the self-harm and the despair, and it named the cause. The affair between Charles and Camilla, which the code had kept in the discreet shadows for more than a decade, was now set out in print for anyone to read. The private arrangement of the Parker Bowles marriage was becoming public property, and there was nothing the people inside it could do to call it back. A single book had taken the most carefully guarded secret of their world and placed it on the shelves of every bookshop in the country. The genius and the cruelty of the book lay in its source. It read as the testimony of outsiders and observers, and only years later was the depth of the princess's own involvement fully understood. But the effect at the time was devastating precisely because it carried the ring of the inside. Here was the private misery of a royal marriage, told with a detail no ordinary journalist could have invented, naming the cause without flinching. For the Parker Bowles arrangement, which had survived a decade and more, precisely because no insider would ever speak, the book was the first proof that the wall of silence had a door in it, after all, and that the door could be opened from within. Everything the code depended on assumed that the people inside a secret would keep it. The book was the announcement that this assumption no longer held, that the age of the insider account had arrived, and that no private arrangement, however grand, was safe from the testimony of someone who had decided to talk. The book was only the beginning of the deluge. That same year came the episode the press labelled Squidgygate, a recording of an intimate telephone conversation between the princess and a male friend, published to a public now ravenous for every detail of the royal marriage's collapse. The tape was a sign of the terrible new thing that technology had made possible. Private conversations could now be intercepted, recorded, and broadcast to millions, and no palace wall was thick enough to stop it. The machinery of discretion, which had protected Alice Keppel and every arrangement like hers, depended on privacy being physically possible. It was becoming, in the age of the scanner and the tabloid, physically impossible, and the people who had staked their whole way of living on privacy did not yet grasp how completely the ground had gone from under them. What had kept the Edwardian world's secrets was gone, and nothing had been built to replace it. It is worth measuring the speed and completeness of the collapse, because it happened faster than anyone inside it could adjust. In the space of a single year, 1992, the affair moved from the discreet shadows, where it had lived unmolested for well over a decade, to the front page of every newspaper in the country. A book in the spring, a recorded call in the summer, a statement to Parliament in December. 3 blows in 12 months, each one heavier than the last, each one stripping away another layer of the privacy the whole arrangement depended on. The people at the centre of it had spent their lives inside a code that assumed the world would look away, and in the space of 1 year, the world stopped looking away and began, instead, to stare without mercy. There was no learning curve for such a change, no time to adapt. The rules that had held for a century simply stopped applying, all at once, to people who had staked everything on their continuing. For Camilla, The transformation was brutal and personal. She had gone, within a year, from a private country wife whom the wider public could not have named to one of the most talked-about women in Britain, and the talk was not kind. The affair, once it was known, cast her at once as the villain of the fairy tale, the older woman who had come between a beloved young princess and her prince. It was a role the public seized with relish, and it would take her more than a decade to escape it. The code that had protected her great-grandmother offered her no shelter at all because the code was already dead, and she was left exposed in the open without the discretion that had been the whole promise of her class. The formal break came before the year was out. On the 9th of December 1992, the Prime Minister rose in the House of Commons and announced to Parliament that the Prince and Princess of Wales were to separate. It was an extraordinary moment, a statement in the seat of British government of the failure of a royal marriage, read out to the elected representatives of the nation as a matter of state. It made official what the whole country had been reading about for months. The fairy tale of 1981 was dead, announced dead from the floor of the Commons, and every reader knew, because Morton's book had told them, the name of the woman at the centre of it. Camilla Parker Bowles was no longer a discreet private figure in a country arrangement. She was becoming one of the most talked about and most hated women in Britain. And her marriage, Andrew's marriage, was becoming a subject of national conversation. For Andrew, these were the years in which the cost of the arrangement finally came due, and it came due in public. For the better part of 2 decades, he had lived by the old code, keeping his counsel, maintaining the appearance, permitting his wife her attachment as she had permitted him his affairs, all of it held safely in the private world where such things belonged. Now that private world was being dismantled, week by week, on the front pages, by forces entirely beyond his control. He had kept his side of a bargain, whose other party, the discretion of the wider world, was defaulting catastrophically. Everything he had protected by his silence was being exposed anyway, and his silence could no longer protect it. Yet still, he did not speak. He gave no interviews. He wrote no articles. He defended himself in no way at all, even as his name became attached, in the public mind, to the most humiliating role a man could be assigned. The position he was in was almost without parallel, and it is worth being precise about it. Here was a decorated soldier, a brigadier, a man who had ridden in the Grand National and led troops in Belfast and been commended for bravery in Rhodesia, a personal guardian of the Queen at her own ceremonies, who now found himself recast in the national imagination as something quite different, the husband whose wife loved the future king. He had done nothing publicly to deserve the humiliation, and he did nothing publicly to escape it. He simply endured and kept up the appearance, out of some combination of the old code, personal dignity, and, it must be said, a shrewd understanding that he had his own conduct to be quiet about. Whatever the mixture of motives, the effect was a strange kind of grace under a pressure few men have ever faced. But the worst of the exposure was still to come. In January of 1993, the one thing the arrangement had always most depended on, the privacy of what was said behind closed doors, would be taken away in a single morning. Chapter 11. The morning the discretion died. In January 1993, the one thing the arrangement had always depended on was taken away from it in a single day. For the whole of its existence, the Parker Bowles marriage and the affair it accommodated had rested on a foundation older than any of the people involved, the assumption that private words stay private, that what is said between 2 people in the confidence of intimacy remains theirs alone. That assumption had protected the great families for centuries. That January, it collapsed completely. and it collapsed for the Parker Bowleses in the most public way any private life has ever been undone. The details of what was published do not belong in this telling, and this film will not repeat them. What matters is not the content, but the fact, and the fact was catastrophic. A private, intimate telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded some years earlier and circulated quietly before finally breaking into the national press, was published in full in the British newspapers. In an instant, the most private register of a relationship, the foolish, tender, unguarded talk that passes between two people who believe themselves alone, was handed to the entire country to read over breakfast. There was no discretion left to protect. There was nothing held back. The innermost privacy of the affair had been turned inside out and pinned to every front page in the land, and it could never be taken back. For the arrangement, this was the end, though the legal end would take 2 more years to arrive. Everything the Parker Bowles marriage had been built to preserve, the appearance, the discretion, the careful separation of public face and private truth, was destroyed in that single publication. The whole point of the old code was that it kept private things private. Now nothing was private. The affair that had run for years in the discreet shadows of the Hunt country was the most exposed relationship in Britain, and Camilla, who had lived her whole life by the rule that such matters were never spoken of aloud, was now spoken of aloud by everyone in the crudest terms, without mercy. The backlash, by the accounts of those close to it, was savage. A woman raised to the absolute privacy of her class had become the most publicly dissected private life in the country, mocked in playgrounds and pubs and on every front page, a national object of ridicule. The recording at the centre of it had been made years before it surfaced, intercepted from the air in the winter of 1989, and circulated quietly for a long time before the newspapers finally printed it. That gap matters, because it shows how the new technology worked. A private conversation could be captured and then held, like a loaded weapon, until the moment it would do the most damage. The people whose words had been taken had no idea, for years, that their most intimate talk was sitting in other hands, waiting. This was the terror of the new age for people raised in the old one. In the world of Alice Keppel, a secret spoken behind a closed door stayed behind that door forever. In the world Camilla and Charles now inhabited, a secret spoken into a telephone might reach the whole nation years later, at a time chosen by strangers. The very idea of privacy, on which the entire code rested, had been quietly abolished, and the people who most needed to understand that were the last to grasp it. For Andrew, the timing of the exposure carried its own particular cruelty. In the very years the scandal broke, he held the office of Silver Stick in waiting, standing at the Queen's side at the great state occasions, the visible image of a man the Crown trusted with its person. He was, at one and the same time, one of the sovereign's ceremonial protectors and the most famous wronged husband in the country, and both things were true in public at once. No man had ever occupied so exact a contradiction, loyal servant and national punchline, guardian of the monarch and casualty of the monarch's heir. And through all of it, he said nothing, and kept standing his post, and let the contradiction stand unresolved. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that silence must have cost, because it is easy to admire from a distance and hard to imagine from within. Every day, through the worst of the exposure, Andrew Parker Bowles rose and went about a public life of the highest respectability, in uniform, at the sovereign's ceremonies, knowing that every stranger who recognized him was thinking of the one thing he would never discuss. There was no escape from it, and no answer to it that he was willing to give. A word to a friendly journalist would have shifted the story, softened the caricature, won him sympathy. He never spoke the word. Whether he stayed silent from the discipline of his class, or from the calculation that his own conduct was best left unexamined, or from simple pride, the effect on the man himself must have been a strain few could have borne without breaking. He did not break. He carried the humiliation the way he had once carried physical danger, without visible flinch, and he carried it for years, in full public view, alone. And where in all of this was Andrew? He was, at the moment of the publication, still a serving officer of the highest respectability, close to the end of a distinguished career, a man whose entire public identity was bound up with dignity, discretion, and service to the crown. The contrast between his public station and his new private notoriety was almost unbearable to contemplate. In the very years he had stood as silver stick in waiting at the Queen's side, he was now, in the eyes of the whole nation, unmistakably the husband at the centre of the most famous marital scandal in modern British history. Everyone knew it, everyone was talking about it, and he could do nothing to change a word of it. The appearance he had spent 20 years maintaining had been stripped away in a morning, not by any act of his own, but by the collapse of the discretion he had trusted the world to keep. The trust that had failed him is the true subject of this chapter, because it was not naive. The entire life Andrew and Camilla had built rested on the belief that their world would hold its tongue, that the old machinery of privacy would go on working as it had for their parents and grandparents, that a great family's arrangements could be kept behind its own doors by common consent. That belief had been reasonable once. In the world of Alice Keppel, it had been simple fact, proven by the smooth management of a king's own affair. But the world had changed under their feet while they went on living by its old rules, and the technology and the appetite that destroyed them had not existed in the age whose code they were obeying. They were the last people to trust a machinery of discretion that had already broken, and the trust was answered with total exposure. So long as the appearance held, the arrangement had been not only survivable, but in its way, dignified. The appearance no longer held. It had been shattered, and it would never be rebuilt. Even now, at the lowest and most humiliating point of the whole ordeal, Andrew Parker Bowles did the thing that would come to define him. He said nothing. He did not go to the press to give his side, though the press would have paid a fortune for it, enough to change his life. He did not denounce his wife, or the prince, or blame anyone at all. He absorbed the exposure with the same silence he had kept through everything, and he preserved, even in the ruins, a certain immovable dignity that would, in the years to come, earn him a strange and unexpected respect. But dignity could not save the marriage now. The discretion that had held it together was dead, killed in a single January morning, and the only question left was how and when, and with how much grace the long arrangement would finally be brought to its formal end. The answer would come on a television screen, on a summer evening the following year, when the prince himself said aloud to 13 million people the thing that made the ending inevitable. Chapter 12. A Confession to 13 Million. The end came not in a courtroom, but on a television screen, on a summer evening in 1994. For more than a year after the publication of the intercepted call, the affair and everything around it had continued to be picked over in the press. But there remained, in theory, a thread of deniability, the possibility that the prince might never confirm with his own mouth what the whole country now believed. That thread was cut on the 29th of June, 1994, when the Prince of Wales sat down in front of a television camera and answered a direct question with a directness that startled the nation. The occasion was a documentary made by the broadcaster Jonathan Dimbleby, titled Charles, the Private Man, the Public Role, broadcast on the independent network to an audience estimated at around 13 million viewers. It was intended, in part, to rehabilitate the prince's image after the battering of the previous years, to show the serious, dutiful man behind the tabloid caricature, the environmentalist and the thinker. But it will be remembered for one exchange above all others. Asked whether he had been faithful to his wife, the prince admitted that he had not. He had tried, he said, until the marriage had irretrievably broken down, both of them having tried. It was a careful answer, hedged and sorrowful, but its meaning was unmistakable, and the following day his own private secretary confirmed to the press what the whole audience had already understood. The other woman was Camilla Parker Bowles. The significance of that broadcast for this story cannot be overstated. Everything before it, the book, the tapes, the newspaper transcripts, had been, in a sense, testimony from outside, the accounts of journalists and interceptors and estranged wives. Now the central fact had been confirmed by the one man whose confirmation truly mattered, spoken aloud, on camera, to 13 million people at once. The prince had told the nation that he had committed adultery, and the nation knew the name of the woman, and the woman was Andrew Parker Bowles's wife. There was no longer any appearance left to maintain, not even the thinnest pretense. The private truth of the Parker Bowles marriage had been made, by the prince's own words, a matter of settled public record, confessed to the whole country on a single evening. The scale of that audience is worth holding in the mind, because it is the scale of the humiliation. Around 13 million people watched the prince make his admission, a great fraction of the adult population of the country, gathered in their sitting rooms on a summer evening to hear the heir to the throne confess to adultery. 13 million witnesses to the central fact of Andrew Parker Bowles's private life, delivered by the man who had shared it. There is no private grief in that. Whatever a lesser exposure might have left him, this left him nothing, no corner of deniability, no last shred of the appearance. The marriage he had kept up for 21 years was now, by the prince's own mouth, common knowledge in 13 million homes at once, and there was not a single thing he could do about it, but what he had always done, which was to say nothing at all. The contrast between the two men in that moment tells its own story. Charles had spoken, on camera, to 13 million people, seeking to explain himself, to win understanding, to control the narrative of his own life. Andrew had done the opposite of all of it. He had sought no platform, offered no explanation, asked for no sympathy. Where the prince reached for the microphone, the brigadier turned his back on it, and it is a strange fact, one the film keeps returning to, that of the two men, it was the silent one who emerged from the decade with the more intact reputation. The man who explained himself to the nation was pitied and mocked by turns. The man who said nothing was, in time, half admired for it. In the new world of confession and exposure, silence had become the rarest performance of all, and it played, against every expectation, as strength. The broadcast marked a threshold in the life of the monarchy itself, and Andrew's private ordeal was, in a sense, a small casualty of that larger crossing. For centuries, the royal family had lived behind a wall of deference, its private truths shielded by a press that would not print them and a public that did not expect to be told. That wall came down, piece by piece, across the early 90s, and the prince's televised confession was the moment it fell completely, the heir to the throne discussing his own adultery on camera for the nation to judge. Everything that had protected the old arrangements, the deference, the discretion, the shared agreement to look away, was gone, and it was not coming back. Andrew and Camilla had built their marriage inside the shelter of that old world, and they lived to see the shelter demolished around them. The confession that exposed them was also the announcement of a new age, one in which nothing about the great and powerful would ever again be reliably private, and in which the old code they had lived by would look, to everyone who had not been raised in it, simply incomprehensible. And still, through the whole ordeal, one voice remained silent. Andrew Parker Bowles, whose marriage had now been dissolved in all but law before the eyes of the entire country, said not a word. He did not respond to the broadcast. He did not comment on the confirmation. In the greatest media storm of the age, with his own private life at its very center, he maintained the total silence he had kept from the beginning. It was, by now, a silence so complete and so sustained that it had become something more than reticence. It had become his defining act, the one thing that set him apart from every other figure in the drama, all of whom, in one way or another, had spoken. Diana had cooperated with her biographer and would soon give an interview of her own that shook the monarchy to its roots. Charles had confessed on television. The tapes had spoken for the lovers, whether they wished it or not. Only Andrew held his peace, and the peace he held became, in the end, the most eloquent thing about him. What that silence meant is the question this whole film is built to hold, and it is worth stating both readings plainly, because both are true, and they do not cancel out. On one reading, Andrew's silence was the last aristocratic virtue left standing, a refusal to trade his private life for money or revenge in an age when almost everyone around him was doing precisely that. He could have sold his story for a fortune. He could have taken his revenge on the man who had loved his wife for 20 years. He did neither. He behaved, throughout, like a man who believed that some things are not for sale and some grievances not for airing. And in a squalid decade, that belief looked almost noble. On the other reading, the silence was also, and at the same time, entirely convenient. A man who had himself been unfaithful for the whole of his marriage, who had tolerated and by some accounts encouraged his wife's affair, and who kept his honours, his royal friendships, and his standing intact by never once making trouble, had every practical reason in the world to say nothing. Speaking would have cost him everything. Silence cost him nothing, and won him admiration. Both things are true. The honest verdict is that they were true together, and that they were, in the end, the same silence. By the summer of 1994, the arrangement was over in every way but the legal one. The appearance was gone. The discretion was dead. The prince had confessed. The marriage that had begun in a chapel full of royalty 21 years before had been reduced, by forces the couple had never controlled, to a spent and public thing, its every secret aired, its every pretense abandoned. All that remained was to end it formally, and even in that, the Parker Bowleses would prove true to the code that had governed their whole life together. There would be no courtroom battle, no war of accusations, no final settling of scores. There would be, instead, one last exercise in keeping up appearances, a divorce conducted with such quiet dignity that it would say more about who these two people really were than all the years of scandal that preceded it. Chapter 13. A paragraph of careful prose. When the marriage finally ended, it ended the way it had been lived, with restraint and a statement agreed by both. Andrew had retired from the army in 1994, closing a career of 34 years in uniform, from his commission into the Blues in 1960 to his final post as director of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps. With the soldiering done and the arrangement long since exposed, there was nothing left to hold the formal marriage together, no career to protect, no appearance still worth the maintaining. In January 1995, Andrew and Camilla Parker Bowles announced that they would divorce. And the manner of the announcement was, in its own quiet way, the most eloquent thing either of them ever said about their marriage. There was no acrimony in it, none of the mutual destruction that had marked the collapse of the royal marriage running alongside it. Instead, the couple issued a jointly agreed statement, composed with evident care, and its words are worth attending to closely, because they are almost the only public account the two of them ever gave of their own union. Throughout their marriage, they said, they had always tended to follow rather different interests, but in recent years they had led completely separate lives. They had grown apart, the statement continued, to such an extent that, with the exception of their children and a lasting friendship, there was little of common interest between them. And there the public account ended, in a few lines of dignified, deliberately undramatic prose. Read one way, it is a masterpiece of discretion, telling the literal truth while concealing almost everything. Completely separate lives. A lasting friendship. Every word was accurate, and every word held back the ocean of scandal beneath it. There was no mention of the prince, no mention of the affairs on either side, no blame, no bitterness, no settling of accounts. It was the code speaking one last time, the old aristocratic habit of keeping the private truth private, applied now to the ending of the marriage, as it had been applied to its whole difficult length. Even in dissolution, so long as the appearance held, the Parker Bowleses would keep it held. They had begun with an announcement in the newspapers placed by their fathers, and they ended with an announcement to the newspapers placed by themselves, and both, in their different ways, put the appearance before the private truth, exactly as the code required. There is a particular dignity in the phrase "a lasting friendship," sitting where it does in that statement, and it deserves a moment's attention because it turned out to be the truest thing in the whole document. Divorcing couples say a great many things in their announcements, and most of them are the polite fictions of the moment, forgotten within the year. When Andrew and Camilla said that a lasting friendship would survive their marriage, they were not softening a hard truth for the newspapers. They were stating a plain fact that the next 30 years would prove exactly correct. They would remain close through his second marriage and her royal one, through a bereavement and a coronation, until the very end of their lives. Almost nothing else in the public story of these two people was as simple as the press made it. But this one line was simpler than anyone believed. They meant it, and they kept it. The legal process was as smooth as the statement. It was a no-fault divorce, founded on the 2 years of separation the couple had by then observed, and the decree was made absolute on the 3rd of March, 1995. And here the record settles a small but important point that the title of this film turns on. The marriage had begun on the 4th of July, 1973, and ended, in law, on the 3rd of March, 1995. That is 21 years, complete and counted. A marriage that had passed its 21st anniversary the previous summer and would never reach its 22nd. 21 years, from the chapel to the decree. The number is exact, and it is the measure of how long two people had kept an arrangement running that most marriages could not have survived for a fraction of the time. The establishment's reaction to the divorce was not dismay but relief, and one voice captured it with aristocratic bluntness. The courtier Lord Charteris, a man who had served at the very heart of the royal household, summed up the mood in a single dry line. Divorce, he said, would clear the air. And yes, of course he will be king. In that one sentence lay the whole calculation of the establishment. The divorce removed an awkwardness, tidied a scandal, cleared the ground for the prince's future. Andrew, in being divorced, was quietly performing one last service to the crown he had served all his life, stepping aside so that the air might be cleared, and asking nothing in return, and complaining of nothing. He had spent his career in the service of the monarchy, and now, at its cost to himself, he served it once more, by the simple act of letting go without a fuss. The mechanics of the divorce were as understated as its manner. It was granted on the ground of 2 years of separation, with the consent of both parties, the gentlest legal route available, one that required no allegation of fault, no naming of names, no airing in open court of the affairs on either side. In a decade when the royal marriage next door was being fought to the death through the press, the Parker Bowleses chose the one legal path that guaranteed silence, and they walked it without a public word of complaint from either of them. It would have been the easiest thing in the world, at that moment, for Andrew to sell the true story, to name the prince, to claim the wronged husband's revenge in the newspapers that would have paid a fortune for it. Every incentive of the age pointed that way. He did none of it. He signed the quiet papers, agreed the careful statement, and let the marriage end as privately as its ending could be arranged. It was the last time the old code would govern this marriage, and it governed the ending as completely as it had governed everything before. And so the number stands, exact and final. 21 years from the chapel in 1973 to the decree in 1995. 21 years of a marriage that the world had believed in and the couple had quietly rewritten, held together by children and faith and the old accommodations of their class, and ended, when it ended, with the same restraint that had run through the whole of it. Most marriages that carry the weight this one carried do not last a fraction of that time. This one lasted 21 years and ended in friendship, and that alone should tell the honest observer that whatever the marriage was, it was not the simple wreckage the headlines described. So the marriage that had begun as the society wedding of the season ended not in a courtroom brawl, but in a paragraph of careful prose, agreed between two people who, whatever else they had failed to be to each other, had never stopped being, in some real sense, on the same side. It is an astonishing thing when you set it beside the wreckage of the royal marriage next door. All recrimination and televised wounds and a war carried on in public to the bitter end. The Parker Bowleses simply, quietly, and with perfect manners, agreed to stop being married and remained friends. The ending was the last and clearest proof of what the marriage had really been all along. Not a betrayal, not a war, but an arrangement entered into and departed from by mutual consent, its dignity intact to the final line. And what came after the divorce would prove the point beyond any doubt. Chapter 14. The friendship that outlived the marriage. What happened after the divorce is the truest evidence of what the marriage had really been. If the union had been the simple tragedy the newspapers described, a wronged husband and an unfaithful wife, then its ending should have brought bitterness, distance, the ordinary cold silence of two people glad to be rid of each other. Nothing of the kind occurred. Instead, both of them moved on into contented later lives. And most tellingly of all, they remained close, bound by an affection that the divorce did not so much end as simply formalize. The friendship outlived the marriage, and in outliving it, revealed what had been underneath the whole time. Andrew wasted little time in building a happy second act. In 1996, the year after the divorce, he married Rosemary Pittman, a woman he had known for years, born in 1940, who had previously been married to a lieutenant colonel and had 3 sons of her own. By every account, the marriage was a genuinely happy one, warm and settled, and free of the strain that had run beneath his first. In Rosemary, Andrew seems to have found the straightforward companionship that had eluded him for so long, and the later years of his life, in her company, were among his most contented. The man who had been unable to commit as a young officer, who had to be forced to the altar by a notice in the Times, had in the end made 2 marriages, and the second of them was, by the accounts of those who knew them, simply and unremarkably good. It is as though, freed at last from the impossible arrangement, he could finally do the ordinary thing well. Rosemary herself deserves more than a passing mention, for she was the making of Andrew's happiest years. Born Rosemary Dickinson in 1940, she had been married before to a lieutenant colonel and had 3 sons of her own, so that she came to Andrew already the centre of a family and entirely at home in his world of soldiers and horses and the country. Those who knew the couple describe a marriage of easy, unshowy contentment, the very thing that had eluded Andrew across the whole of his first marriage. There were no shadows in it, no arrangement, no third person. Only 2 people in their later years who suited each other and knew it. For a man whose first marriage had been a masterpiece of managed appearances, the second was refreshingly plain, and by every account, it made him happy in a way the great, glamorous first marriage never had. That contentment lasted until her death, which came at the start of the year 2010, and which drew from the whole extended family a response that no ordinary history of divorce and remarriage could explain. The grief was shared across every line that connected these people, the first wife and the old royal friend and the children of 2 marriages, all of them gathered by loss rather than divided by it. It is one thing to divorce without rancour. It is another for an ex-wife to mourn her successor with genuine sorrow, and for that sorrow to be public and unforced. The bond that made such a thing possible had been built long before, in the years of the marriage itself, and it had survived everything: the affairs, the exposure, the divorce, the remarriages, intact to the end. Whatever the marriage had been, it had left behind it not enemies, but a family, and the family held. The measure of how civilized these people managed to keep their tangled lives came when Rosemary died. She was lost to complications of cancer on the 10th of January 2010, and her death drew from Andrew's first wife a response that no ordinary divorce could ever have produced. Camilla, by then remarried herself, and moving in the highest royal circles, was reported to be deeply saddened by Rosemary's death, and marked it publicly, attending a memorial service that spring. Princess Anne, Andrew's friend of half a century, was among the mourners at the funeral, held at a Catholic church near the Wiltshire country both families loved. The former wife grieving the second wife, the old royal friend at the graveside, the whole extended and complicated family gathering in shared sorrow rather than lingering rancour. It is a scene almost impossible to imagine in an ordinary broken marriage, and it tells you everything about the unusual grace with which these particular people carried their history. Camilla, meanwhile, was undergoing a transformation that would have seemed impossible at the depth of the scandal. The woman who had been the most vilified figure in Britain, blamed for the collapse of the fairy tale, dissected without mercy in the press, slowly and patiently rebuilt her public standing over the years that followed the divorce. It was done carefully, without drama, in the same unhurried and stubborn way she had once waited years for Andrew to propose. She endured the hostility. She did not fight it loudly. She simply, over time, allowed the country to grow used to her, to see the warmth and the humour that those who knew her had always seen, until the hatred faded into acceptance and eventually into something close to affection. The same patience that had carried her through a 7-year courtship carried her through a decade of public loathing, and it worked both times. Through all of it, the family that the marriage had produced held together as a family. Tom and Laura, the 2 children raised at Bolhide and Middlewick, grew into adults with lives of their own. Tom, a food writer of some note, both of them the shared children of parents who had divorced without dividing them. The prince remained Tom's godfather. Andrew remained close to Princess Anne, godfather to her own daughter, a friend of half a century standing at the heart of the same royal circle he had always moved in. What might, in an ordinary broken family, have splintered into estrangement and taken sides, instead stayed whole. There was one family here, complicated and extended and threaded through with second marriages and royal remarriage, and it went on being one family, gathering for the weddings and the funerals, holding to the friendships, keeping the peace. It is the quiet miracle underneath the loud scandal, and it is the strongest evidence of all that the marriage, whatever it had been built on something real. And Andrew, through all of Camilla's long rehabilitation, remained exactly what he had always been to her since the divorce, a friend. There was no estrangement, no awkward distance, none of the coldness the world might have expected between a man and the wife who had left him for a prince. The two of them, having failed at being married, succeeded completely at being friends, and the friendship ran on through the deaths and the remarriages and the slow turning of public opinion. It is the detail that most confounds the simple story. If Andrew had truly been the wronged and bitter husband of the tabloid imagination, this friendship could not have existed. That it did exist, easily and durably for the rest of their lives, is the strongest possible evidence that the marriage had never been a simple matter of one person wronging another, but something both of them had built and managed, and, in the end, dissolved together, and grieved together, and outlived together. The final proof of the friendship's endurance, and the final scene of the whole long story, was still to come, and it would take place on the grandest stage the country possesses. For the man who had married Camilla first, in a chapel full of royalty half a century earlier, would live to see her crowned, and would be there, among the family, to watch it happen. What had begun as the society wedding of the season would find its last echo in Westminster Abbey, with the first husband seated in the congregation, applauding as his former wife became queen. How astonishing that final image truly is becomes clear only by tracing, in one last chapter, the road that led from a quiet country divorce to a crowning in Westminster Abbey. Chapter 15. The First Husband in the Abbey. On the 6th of May, 2023, the man who had married Camilla first sat among the family and watched her crowned. It is one of the most quietly astonishing images in the whole of modern British history, and it is the natural ending of this story, the final scene toward which every earlier chapter has been moving. To arrive at it, though, requires one more step, to the moment the long arrangement completed its circle and the affair that had run in the shadows for a generation was, at last, made lawful and open. That moment came on the 9th of April 2005, when Charles and Camilla were finally married in a civil ceremony at the Windsor Guildhall. It had taken decades, 2 other marriages, a death, a national scandal, and the slow, patient rebuilding of Camilla's reputation. But the two people who had loved each other since around 1970 were, in the end, husband and wife. The mistress had become the wife, lawfully and openly. And here the true nature of the whole tangled history showed itself once more, because among those who had made their peace with the union was Andrew Parker Bowles himself, remarried, content, and entirely without visible bitterness. The former husband had long since given his blessing, in the only way he ever did anything, quietly and without a word of complaint. The man who might, by the world's expectations, have been the one figure to resent this wedding above all others, was instead among those who wished it well. The distance the country had travelled to reach that wedding was enormous, and it had been travelled almost entirely by Camilla. A little over a decade earlier, She had been the most vilified woman in Britain, blamed for the ruin of the fairy tale, unable to walk down a street without hostility. Now she was marrying the future king, with the public's grudging blessing, and within a few years more she would be openly liked. The rehabilitation was one of the most complete in modern public life, and it had been achieved by the same means she had used to win Andrew in the first place: patience, warmth, and the refusal to be hurried or to fight loudly. She simply waited for the country to see what those close to her had always seen, and eventually it did. The mistress the code would once have kept forever in the shadows had walked all the way out of them and into the open, lawfully married to the man she had loved for 35 years. And the nation, in the end, wished her well. 18 years later came the coronation. Charles III was crowned king, and Camilla, once the most hated woman in Britain, was crowned queen beside him in Westminster Abbey before the nation and the world. And seated among the congregation, with the 2 children he and Camilla had raised together present alongside him, was Andrew Parker Bowles. The first husband, in his 80s, watched the wife he had married half a century before become Queen of the United Kingdom, crowned beside the man who had been part of their marriage's arrangement for its entire length. The press, reaching for a phrase, called them the friendliest of exes, and let the strangeness of the scene pass with a shrug. But held still and looked at directly, the image is extraordinary almost beyond comprehension. A whole century of the aristocratic code compressed into a single afternoon under the vaults of the Abbey. There is a physical monument to the man at the centre of all this, and it is worth ending his portrait upon it, because it captures the peculiar scale his life finally reached. In the years around 2003 and 2004, Andrew sat for the painter Lucian Freud, one of the greatest portraitists of the age, who produced an enormous canvas of him, some 7 feet high, wearing his household cavalry uniform. It was titled The Brigadier. In November of 2015, that painting sold at auction in New York for nearly $35 million, making the image of the cuckolded soldier, as the crueler commentators had it, one of the most valuable British portraits of its age. There is a bitter poetry in it that the story cannot resist. The uniform, the public self, the loyal servant of the crown, immortalized on canvas and sold for a fortune, while the marriage it had stood beside was long dissolved. In the end, the appearance, quite literally, was worth more than the reality, and it hangs somewhere still, 7 feet of a man who never explained himself. And what of the great historical rhyme that ran beneath the whole story? It, too, completed itself, and completed itself in a way its Edwardian original could never have imagined. Camilla's great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, had been the mistress of a king and had managed the affair in the Edwardian age with the smooth and total discretion the old code allowed. Camilla, 3 generations later, had begun as a mistress in the same tradition and ended as a crowned and lawful queen. What the code had once kept in the shadows had, in the age that destroyed the code, come at last fully into the light and onto the throne itself. Alice Keppel could never have been queen. Her great-granddaughter was. The arrangement that had once required perfect concealment ended, in the changed world, in an open crowning before the eyes of all, the mistress become the monarch, the secret become the state occasion. The portrait that fixes Andrew's own image in this final act had been made in the years before the coronation, when he sat for Lucian Freud across the sessions of 2003 and 2004. Freud worked slowly, over many long sittings, and the result was vast. A canvas roughly 7 feet high, the brigadier in his household cavalry uniform, painted with the merciless honesty for which Freud was famous. It was titled simply, The Brigadier. When it was sold in New York in the autumn of 2015, it fetched close to $35 million, one of the highest prices ever paid for a British portrait of the age. There is no escaping the irony that the image sold for a fortune was the image of the public man, the uniform, the loyal soldier, the appearance, while the private truth it stood beside had long since been dissolved and forgotten. Andrew Parker Bowles never explained the private truth to anyone. He let the uniform speak, and the uniform, in the end, was worth a fortune, and said nothing at all. To sit in that abbey, then, an old man among the family, and watch the wife of his youth crowned Queen of the United Kingdom, was the strangest possible completion of a strange life. The children he and Camilla had raised together were there beside him. The man who had loved his wife across the whole length of their marriage was on the throne. And Andrew, who had said nothing for 50 years, said nothing still, and simply watched and applauded, and let the astonishing scene close over him without a word of comment. It was the last public act of the arrangement, and it was, fittingly, silent. Andrew Parker Bowles, at the last, remained what he had been throughout, present, dignified, and silent. He never wrote the memoir the world half expected of him. He never sold the story that would have made him rich. He went on riding out at Ascot into his 80s, stayed close to Princess Anne, godfather to her daughter, and was reported, late in 2023, to have found companionship again in a relationship with the broadcaster Anne Robinson. His silence, kept across 50 years, was in the end his monument, more lasting than the Freud portrait, and less easily bought. But that silence leaves a question behind it, the same question the whole film has carried from the first chapter, and it is time in the last chapter to face it directly. Chapter 16. Devotion or Arrangement. In the end, the marriage leaves a question it will not answer, about the difference between loyalty and convenience. For 21 years, two people performed a marriage that Britain believed in and lived a marriage that Britain would not have forgiven. And the whole of this story has been an attempt to understand how and why and what it finally means. The honest answer is that it means two things at once, and the two do not cancel out, and the refusal to choose between them is the truest thing that can be said about Andrew and Camilla Parker Bowles. Look first at the arrangement from the outside, as a thing built and maintained. And the most striking fact is that it was never the achievement of two people alone. It took a whole world to keep it standing. It took the two families who had made the match, publishing the engagement in the newspaper to force it into being. It took the faith that made divorce close to unthinkable, and so made accommodation necessary. It took the ancient code of the county, the tolerance of the discreet affair, the separate rooms, the appearances kept up. It took the palace, which valued Andrew's loyalty and wanted the whole difficulty tidied quietly away. And it took the press, for as long as the press still agreed to look away. The arrangement was not a private failing. It was a collective achievement, held up by everyone who had a stake in it, and it fell only when the last of those supports, the discretion of the wider world, finally gave way. That is the first truth, and it is a hard one. What looked like the private choice of two people was really the work of an entire establishment, keeping one of its own marriages standing by common consent. But look at the same marriage from the inside, at the level of the two human beings who actually lived it, and a second and gentler truth appears, and it is just as real. Inside the arrangement were two people who genuinely liked each other. They laughed together. They raised two children they both loved, in a home that by every account was warm. They extended each other across 2 decades, a tolerance that in its own strange way was a kind of loyalty, each permitting the other the freedom neither could give up, and neither using it as a weapon. And when it was over, they did the thing that no merely cynical arrangement could ever produce. They stayed friends for the rest of their lives, through second marriages and bereavements and the slow turning of the world, until one of them stood in Westminster Abbey and watched the other crowned. Whatever that marriage was, it was not loveless, and it was not, in the ordinary sense, a lie. Both of them knew exactly what they had agreed to, and both kept faith with the agreement to the end. So which was it, in the final reckoning? Was Andrew Parker Bowles a man of honour, who kept his dignity and his silence when every temptation urged him to sell them, or a man of convenience, who stayed quiet because quiet cost him nothing and won him everything? Was the marriage a devotion of an unusual and clear-eyed kind, or an arrangement of the coldest sort, dressed in the manners of affection? The evidence, honestly weighed, points down both roads at once, and it always will, because the two were never truly separate. His honour and his convenience were the same silence. The devotion and the arrangement were the same marriage. To ask the country to choose between them is to misunderstand the world that produced them, a world in which honour and convenience had long ago learned to wear each other's clothes, and in which a man might be entirely sincere and entirely comfortable in the same breath. There is a temptation, faced with a life like Andrew Parker Bowles's, to demand a verdict, to insist that he must have been, underneath it all, either a good man or a calculating one. But the demand mistakes the kind of creature he was, and the kind of world that made him. He was a brave soldier and an unfaithful husband. He was a loyal servant of the crown, and a man whose marriage was quietly ruined by the crown's own heir. He was silent out of dignity and silent out of self-interest, and there was never a moment when the one motive could be cleanly separated from the other. He was, in short, a whole man of a particular class and a particular age, formed by a code that prized appearances above confessions and loyalty above passion, and he lived that code more completely, and to a stranger conclusion, than almost anyone of his generation. To judge him by the standards of a later and more confessional age is to measure him with an instrument built for a different world. The same could be said of the marriage as a whole, and of the woman who shared it. Camilla has been cast, across the years, as villain and victim, and finally as queen, and none of the roles quite fits, because each of them measures her by a standard she never accepted. She was a woman of her class and her family, raised on the example of a great-grandmother who had loved a king and survived it, and she lived by the same lights, loving where she loved, and keeping the appearance her world required. That the modern age found this monstrous, and then, in time, forgave it, and then crowned it, says as much about the age's shifting appetites as about the woman herself. The truth of these two people lies underneath all the verdicts, in the quiet fact that they built a marriage on the terms their world allowed, kept it for 21 years, and remained bound in friendship for 30 years after it ended. Everything else, the scandal, the vilification, the rehabilitation, the crown, was the world reacting to them. This was who they actually were. And perhaps that is the deepest thing this one marriage reveals about power, about class, and about the strange permissions granted to those born near the top. The great have always been allowed arrangements that others are not, and have always been able to call those arrangements by finer names. A country solicitor who lived as the Parker Bowleses lived would have been the subject of a squalid divorce and a lasting shame. A brigadier and a queen were the subject of a coronation. That Britain chose, in the end, to remember Andrew Parker Bowles as a gentleman rather than an accomplice, and to reward the whole tangled story with a crowning rather than a reckoning, may say less about the truth of two hearts than about the enduring hunger of a nation for a tidy ending, and the enduring willingness of an establishment to give one of its own the benefit of every doubt. Return, at the last, to where it began, to the 4th of July, 1973, the Guards' Chapel, full of 800 guests, the Queen Mother and the two princesses in the pews, the tiara from a mistress's family on the bride's head, the decorated soldier and the woman who had waited 7 years for him, walking out into the summer sun. Everyone in that chapel believed they were watching a beginning, and so they were, though not the beginning they imagined. What began that morning was not a fairy tale and not a tragedy, but something the old world understood and the new one never forgave. An arrangement entered in good faith, kept for 21 years, and dissolved in friendship, devoted in public, unfaithful in private, and, in the end, impossible to judge, because the two people at its center had agreed, from the very first, to keep the appearance up, so long as it could be held. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because there are more like it coming, the true lives behind Britain's grandest names told with the doors open. And tell me in the comments where you land on the man himself. Do you think Andrew Parker Bowles was a man of honor or a man of convenience? And would you have kept the marriage the way he did? I read every reply, and I would like to know what you think.